Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So the good news is, I think you have a lot more flexibility with buying for mom or for female readers in general, because as I said at the beginning, women do tend to read more than men statistically, and tend to be a little bit more omnivoracious in terms of what they're willing to read. For example, like men are in general, pretty resistant to the idea, for instance, of reading a romance, whereas women would be fine with reading more fine with reading like an action adventure type thing that tend to be targeted to men. So take that for what it's worth. It does tend to be a little easier buying for women than for men. That being said, there are some genres that I think I've noticed that women tended to buy more of or be gifted more of. So let's get into what those are. So let's start with essentially what I called like women's lib nonfiction. We'll start with nonfiction in general, and specifically like things about women, by women, for women. A certain type of mom is going to be into that. Like I would be down with getting these books. I have a lot of these types of books, and yeah, there's definitely a demographic out there for them. So let's get into those. So first, the one I want to recommend is one I have out from the library right now, but don't have a physical copy of, which is Too Fat, Too Loud, Too Slutty by, I think her name is Helen Peterson. And that is basically like a pop cultural analysis of like women who are too much and how they get labeled that way and why they are considered to be too much. So I think that's been great so far, what I've read of it. The classic in this genre, in my opinion, is Are Women Human by Dorothy Sayers. This is a fantastic book, and it's just so good, so I certainly recommend this one. One that was actually released this year that I think is actually, in terms of what it's arguing, is basically identical to Are Women Human, but is maybe a little more approachable just because it is written in letter form, and it's also more kind of cross-sectional because it's coming from an African woman, is Dear Ijewele by Chimamanda and Ngozie Aditchie. This is very short, but it's a beautiful book. It's great, and like I said, highly reminiscent of Are Women Human, which is really a classic. So actually, that might be a fun little duo to get together because they're both pretty short books and they're pretty similar, so that might be kind of like a fun co-gift. A couple of other titles that I think would fall into sort of the category of like historical, like kind of taking a historical view of women's issues. One is Trainwreck by Sadie Doyle. You guys know that I really like this book a lot. It does kind of interweave some of the pop culture stuff that, for instance, Too Fat, Too Loud, Too Slutty is doing, but it's really taking a history of women who have been publicly shamed or have publicly shamed themselves, and it's a very interesting history. The other one that I would say is All the Single Ladies by Rebecca Traister, which was a big title last year, I believe. And this is a history of essentially single women in America, and is fascinating. So my final recommendation in this area is one that you're going to have to know your mom to know whether or not this is something appropriate, or the female that you're giving this to. But this is a really great book, and it's more science-y, which is called Come As You Are by Emily Nagoski. And basically this is all about female sexual pleasure and like the latest science behind it, like why so many women struggle to reach orgasm, things like that. This is a fascinating book, and I think really helpful in kind of thinking through gender versus sex, and kind of like why women biologically might struggle to find pleasure, things like that. Anyway, as you can tell from what I'm describing, you're gonna have to know whether or not this is something appropriate for your mom, but it is a very, very good book. Okay, so the next category of nonfiction that I do think women/moms tend to like a lot is memoirs, and I've tried to include sort of like a good mix of memoirs. The first one that I want to remember to recommend to you guys that I don't have physically, but I have as an audiobook, and I would recommend it as an audiobook, is Tina Fey's her memoir, Bossypants. It came out a few years ago. It's still hilarious. It's still fantastic. Definitely recommend that as an audio pick. Then in terms of like kind of beautiful memoirs or like moving memoirs that will like potentially make your mom cry, and isn't that really all of our goals? First, what is my favorite book of the year so far, and I don't see that changing, is Hunger by Roxane Gay. This came out this year and is just like devastating and so good, and I think especially, I just think this is something women should read, even if they have never been overweight. I think this just touches on a lot of like core kind of issues in terms of like bodies and like what it means to have like a female body in our society and like to be sexualized and yada yada yada. I will give a trigger warning on this, but it is just really, really good. And in terms of another one that I think is just like really just moving and very good is When Women Were Birds by Terry Tempest Williams. This came out a few years ago and is basically a memoir of a woman kind of essentially reckoning with her own relationship with the female, like her mom, her grandma, those people, in the context of the Mormon faith that she was brought up in. And then finally, a couple of celebrity memoirs. I will say, if your mom is into funny celebrity memoirs, I mean, I mentioned Tina Fey's, that's one, and then another one would be Andy Cohen's memoirs are very, very funny, especially if she is a Real Housewife watcher. The other two that I would call like more kind of like literary celebrity memoirs, one is Stephen King on writing. If your mom fancies herself a writer, this might be a good one. This is just a fantastic, fantastic book. And then my all-time favorite memoir that I recommend to everyone because it is so good is My Life in France by Julia Child. Oh, guys, this is just such a beautifully written book, and it's just wonderful, and it's very evocative of a specific time, and it's in France, so it feels just beautiful and romantic, and it's so good. So I definitely recommend this one. The next categories that I'm going to recommend are in the fiction area. So the first thing is that moms, like a bestseller for a mom or female in your life, tend to be pretty solid picks, or like things that often get recommended for like book club reads tend to be good. A few years ago, the classic example of this would have been The Help. That's the exact type of book I'm thinking of. One that I think is popular right now is The Nest. I think that's what it's called. I've seen that, you know, kind of promoted in a similar vein in terms of like, oh, this is good for book clubs. What is it? Sue Monk Kidd has a few of those that I think are kind of book clubby picks. So that can be a good choice. Like basically I would recommend you basically go to your bookstore of choice and see what it is that they've been paid to promote out in the front of their tables. Literary fiction can also be a great route for moms. So one idea is if you know that she loves a specific classic book, to get her like a really nice version of it. So this happens to be The Picture of Dorian Gray, but if you know she loves Pride and Prejudice, get her a nice copy of Pride and Prejudice. If you know that she loves Jane Eyre, get her a nice copy of Jane Eyre. That one right there is very nice. So yeah, that can be a great gift if you know that somebody likes a specific classic. And then just three of my favorite kind of like literary fiction type things that are, you know, not classics, but are sort of modern classics. I think I've talked about all of these before, so I won't go on too long, but Gilead by Marilynne Robinson. Really, any fiction by Marilynne Robinson I'd put in this category. My second all-time favorite book behind Jane Eyre is The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. I love this book so much. It is a weeper, but it is very, very good. And then finally, I may not have talked about this before, but Possession by A.S. Byatt is a really interesting book. I recommend this for moms who also kind of like historical fiction, because it's sort of like a dual timeline, and the movie of this is trash, but the book is very, very good. And then finally, in terms of fiction, you know, women's fiction, chick lit, I hate that, and romance. That can be a good route to go. I am not going to be great at giving you any women's fiction or chick litty type recommendations because I don't personally like reading those, other than the usual suspects like Sophie Kinsella or I think it's Emily Hanna is one of the other big ones. Those type of books, if you know your mom likes that, look and see if that person has a new book out and get her that. In terms of romance that I would feel comfortable recommending people give as a gift, pretty limited to be honest, just because I think it can be very idiosyncratic in terms of what people like and what tropes they're into. So I picked kind of three suggestions that I think are pretty appropriate to give as gifts. I will caveat this by saying if you're not comfortable giving your mom something with sex in it, look for a sweet romance is what they are called. That's where the bedroom door is closed, there's nothing specific happening. But if you're in a good place with your mom that you're not embarrassed to give her a book with some sex in it, and P.S. plenty of non-romance books have sex in them too. So like don't let that hang you up too much. But three recommendations, if you're looking for something that's like small town contemporary romance, I think Susan Mallory is a pretty friendly place to go for like a mom. There is some sex in it, but nothing too crazy, and it reminds me a lot of Gilmore Girls, right? Like, it's very focused on the small town and like all of the friendships and all those dynamics. So I think that can be, to me, Susan Mallory is somebody who straddles the line between women's fiction / chick lit and romance, so I think she can be a good choice. For contemporary romance set in a city, I highly recommend Julie James. The sex in that will probably be a little bit more explicit, but there's not a ton of it, and it's just very, like, the women are so smart, and there's a lot of, like, banter. It's a very, I think it's a friendly point of entry for romance. And then finally, in terms of, like, a historical romance pick, I went with Courtney Milan. This is The Duchess War, which is the first in her brother's Sinister quartet. There's 4 of these. These are just really, really well written. And again, yes, there's sex. I think that it's written very tastefully, and it actually moves the story forward, which is what I think good sex scenes should be doing anyway. And she's just, to me, like, one of the stars in historical romance. If you're looking for someone, like, lighter, because, like, angst can get real in these. If you're looking for someone a little lighter, I think Tessa Dare is a great pick for kind of more lighthearted contemporary romance, and her Spinster Cove series is probably a good place to go for that. And finally, one last category for mom, that is cookbooks. I think if you know that your mom is into cooking a certain way, and this could be for dads too, because I think increasingly cooking is not such a gendered thing, but if you know what kind of things that they like to make, you could do that. Or, for instance, I love this cookbook. This is the Great British Bake Off Big Book of Baking, and this kind of book might be a great present, because if you, for instance, have been watching the show with somebody, this would be a fun gift. There's lots of, for like cooking shows, like reality TV cooking show type things, there's lots of cookbooks out there, and that might be kind of a fun way to, you know, if you've been watching something together, to sort of give something to represent that memory you have with them, and to give them like something that's really useful and great.